Old age doesn't take everything from you. It gives back these three things. Carl Jung. Carl Jung observed that the second half of life has its own agenda, one the ego rarely consents to in advance. And that agenda is not subtraction, it is a strange and quiet form of restitution. Here is where I want to begin, with Nietzsche, who Jung read closely and lectured on for years. In The Joyful Wisdom, section 270, Nietzsche wrote, "You shall become the person you are," and I want you to sit with the strangeness of that line. Not become someone new, not become someone better, become the person you already are, underneath the decades of performance, and Jung would stop you right there and say, "Do you see it? The whole first half of life is spent becoming someone else, someone useful, someone presentable, someone employable, and only in the second half does the debt come due, the debt of becoming who you actually were the entire time. And this is why age frightens us less for what it removes than for what it finally makes undeniable, that the mask cannot be worn forever, that something underneath has been waiting, patiently, for the performance to end. Now let me say the quiet thing plainly, because I think many of you carry it. You have watched your body change, your titles fade, your usefulness to the machine of the world quietly decline, and some part of you has decided this is only loss, only erosion, only the long, slow bill for having once been young. And I want to tell you, gently, you are not the only one who has believed this, and you are not wrong that something is being taken. But Jung's whole late work insists that something is also being handed back. Three things in particular, things the first half of life had to sacrifice in order to build the mask at all. And today, we go looking for them. Before we do, 3 sentences with me. Present tense. First person, quiet ones. I notice the years I spent proving myself, and I ask what they cost me. I notice the parts of me I set aside because they were inconvenient for the role I was playing. I notice that time is no longer infinite, and treat that as information rather than as sentence. And underneath all 3 of those noticings is one motion, the same motion Jung called individuation. So say it with me. I make the unconscious conscious. And again, I make the unconscious conscious. If this kind of teaching helps you carry your own years a little more honestly, staying subscribed means tomorrow's teaching finds you too. And if something in what I just said landed somewhere quiet in you, put the 2 words "face it" in the comments. Just those 2 words. Let it be a small seal on what you already know is true. The first key is this. Old age is not simply decline dressed up in a kinder word. Jung wrote that we cannot live the afternoon of life according to the program of life's morning, and most people hear that line as a warning about mismatch, but hear it instead as a promise, because a program that has run its course is not a tragedy, it is a completion. The morning program built the ego, built the career, built the household, built the reputation, and it built all of that using tools that had to ignore half of what you were. Ambition ignores rest, achievement ignores stillness. The persona you built to be hired and admired had no room in it for the parts of you that only show up in silence. And so the years spent building a life were, quietly, years spent shelving a life, not destroying it, shelving it. And this is the reframe Jung asked of his patients past 35. In his essay on the stages of life, he said, "The second half is not a lesser copy of the first. It has, in his words, a significance entirely its own." And I want you to notice what that does to the fear. If the second half has its own significance, rather than being merely the sunset of the first, then what looks like the world taking things from you, the job, the busy calendar, the certainty of being needed, may in fact be the world clearing a stage for something that could never have performed while the morning program was running. Think of a stage play that has had a long and successful run. The lights, the costumes, the nightly ovation, and then one evening the run simply ends. Not because the play failed, but because its purpose has been fulfilled. The actor who mourns the empty theater as though it were a verdict on his worth has misunderstood the whole shape of a run. Closing night is not the same thing as failure. It is the completion the run was always heading toward. And the same is true of the morning program of a life. Imagine a man who spent 40 years as the reliable one at his company, the one who solved problems, who never showed weakness, and at 65, the company retires him with a dinner and a watch, and for months he feels erased. He wakes at the old hour out of habit and has nowhere urgent to be. He catches himself rehearsing answers to questions no one is asking anymore, and this is the exact moment Jung would ask him to look twice, because the emptiness is not proof that his years were wasted. It is only proof that the program has finished running. And then one evening, he picks up an instrument he abandoned at 19 because it wasn't practical, and something in him that had been waiting since 19 finally exhales. That is not decline. That is the afternoon program finally being allowed to run. Notice too how quietly this arrives. It rarely announces itself as a gift. It feels at first like drift, like uselessness, like a calendar with too much white space in it. And only later, sometimes only in looking back, does the shape of it become visible, the morning program closing so that a second, entirely different program could finally begin its work. I let the old program close without calling it defeat. The second key is the first thing actually given back, and it is the loosening of the persona. Jung defined the persona plainly, that which in reality one is not, but which oneself as well as others think one is. And here is what almost nobody tells you about growing older. The persona was never optional in the first half of life. You needed the mask to be hired, to be married, to be respected, to be safe. The mask was armor, and armor is heavy, but you could not have walked through your 20s and 30s without it. Think of the mask less as a lie and more as a uniform issued for a specific job, the job of surviving among other people who were also wearing uniforms. And no one hands you the uniform for free. You pay for it every single day in small acts of self-editing, the swallowed opinion, the softened tone, the agreeable nod when you felt something entirely different underneath. And here is the part that shocks people. One of the strange mercies of age is that the audience shrinks. Fewer people are watching. Fewer promotions are riding on your performance. Fewer strangers are forming their first impression of you. And when the audience shrinks, the mask gets to come off a little. Not because you have earned some enlightenment, simply because the stage has emptied. Imagine a woman who spent 3 decades as a school teacher, composed in front of 30 children every single day, patient on command, cheerful on command, never once allowed to show the room that she was tired, or afraid, or bored. And when she retires at 62, she notices something odd within weeks. She laughs louder than she used to. She interrupts people mid-sentence when she disagrees. She cries at the news in a way she never permitted herself in the classroom. Her daughter worries something is wrong with her, but nothing is wrong. The uniform came off after 30 years, and the actual woman underneath is simply audible for the first time in a long while. Think about what that ordinary shrinking of audience actually gives back. Think of an ordinary Tuesday at 50 compared to an ordinary Tuesday at 75. At 50, the Tuesday is full of small performances, the composed voice on a work call, the careful phrasing in front of a superior, the practiced patience with a difficult colleague, the effortful cheerfulness at a networking dinner, dozens of small costume changes. By evening, you are depleted in a way you cannot quite name. At 75, the Tuesday has far fewer costume changes. The phone rings less with people who need something performed for them. And what floods into that emptied space is not nothing, it is you, unrehearsed. And Jung would say this is why so many people, quite unexpectedly, become more themselves as they age, blunter, softer in strange places, less patient with false politeness, more patient with real feeling. This is not senility loosening the grip. This is the persona finally being allowed to rest. And it is worth naming honestly that some people panic at this loosening, because if the mask is not who you are, and the audience that required the mask has gone quiet, you are left facing the plain question of who was under there all along. That question is the gift and the terror in a single package. I let the mask rest without mistaking myself for it. The third key is the second thing given back, and it is harder, because it arrives first as a debt collector before it arrives as a gift. Jung wrote plainly, "What in the morning was true will at evening have become a lie." And he meant something specific. Everything you excluded to build your first half-life does not vanish. It waits. In his language, it becomes the unlived life, and the unlived life does not politely fade with age. It grows more insistent, because time has grown visibly finite, and the excluded parts sense, correctly, that this is their last real chance to be lived at all. Think for a moment about what exclusion actually requires. No one sits down at 25 and decides consciously to amputate half of themselves. It happens in small transactions. A young man loves music, but chooses the safer degree because music does not pay rent. A young woman feels a pull toward solitude, but learns early that solitude reads as coldness, so she trains herself into constant availability. 1,000 small transactions like this, each one reasonable, each one necessary, and none of them free, the bill simply does not come due until decades later. Imagine a woman who spent 30 years as the dependable one, the fixer, the one who never needed anything from anyone, and at 60, with no warning she can name, she finds herself furious at family gatherings, weeping at films that never used to move her, restless in a marriage that looks, from outside, entirely fine. This is not a woman falling apart. This is the unlived life sending its invoice. All the needing she was never allowed, all the softness she traded for competence, all the wanting that had no place in the role of the reliable one, arriving now with interest. And here is the walkthrough I want you to actually sit with. Picture an ordinary week in that kind of life. Monday, the old competence runs the show. Tuesday, a small irritation flares over nothing and surprises her with its size. Wednesday, she catches herself staring out a window mid-conversation, somewhere else entirely. Thursday, a memory she has not visited in decades, surfaces uninvited. Friday, she cries in the car for no reason she can defend to herself. By Sunday, she either dismisses the whole week as tiredness, or she recognizes it for what it is, the shelved self, knocking. And notice how easily this gets misread. A doctor might call it a mood. A family might call it a phase. She herself might call it ingratitude for a life that looks, on paper, complete. But Jung would ask a different question entirely. Not what is wrong with her, but what has gone unlived in her. And that single change of question turns the whole week from a symptom into a summons. Jung called this material, appearing not as an enemy, but as an underdeveloped capacity, real feeling, real need, real creative appetite, things that were entirely appropriate to have, simply inconvenient for the role that had to be played. And it is worth saying plainly that this invoice does not only come dressed as grief, sometimes it arrives as a sudden hunger to paint, to travel alone, to write the letter that was never sent, to sit by water and do nothing at all. And the temptation, always, is to treat the hunger as embarrassing, as something too late, as a foolishness unbecoming of a serious adult life. But the hunger is not foolish, it is simply overdue. And the gift hidden inside this uncomfortable arrival is enormous, because this is material the first half of life had no use for, and the second half cannot function without. The reliable one, who finally lets herself need something, is not a woman in decline. She is a woman finally solvent, paying an old account, so she can live without the interest compounding for another decade. This is what Jung meant when he spoke of the second half having its own significance, not a gentler version of youth, a different task entirely, the task of finally becoming whole, rather than merely competent. And this is the second thing old age gives back, not comfort, but the return of everything competence required you to leave behind. I let the unlived life speak instead of silencing it again. The fourth key is the turn, and I want to bring it directly to you, because until now, this has sounded like something that happens to other people. The retired man, the reliable woman, composites you can watch from a safe distance. But ask yourself honestly, what have you already shelved? Not decades from now, already. This year, this month. What did you not say at dinner last week? Because it would have disrupted the peace. What ambition did you quietly downgrade to a hobby because it stopped fitting the schedule of who you are supposed to be? What grief did you postpone because there was no room on the calendar for it? And notice, before we go further, the particular way this shows up, not as a crisis, not as a dramatic collapse, but as a small itch you have learned to manage. Picture an ordinary Wednesday. You are at your desk, or in your kitchen, or driving somewhere familiar, and out of nowhere, a restlessness arrives. Nothing is technically wrong. The bills are paid, the people you love are fine, and yet something in you is pacing, and the trained response, the response the first half of life drilled into you, is to treat that pacing as a nuisance, to reach for the phone, the errand, the small task that will drown it out. And this is precisely where Jung would ask you to stop, because what you just called a nuisance may in fact be a message, and you silence the messenger instead of reading the message. Jung's teaching about the tension of opposites applies here with real weight. He wrote that the greatest problems of life are never solved, only outgrown. And I think this is exactly what age offers, that youth cannot. Not a solution to the old conflicts, competence against feeling, duty against desire, the mask against the unlived life, but a widening of the container that used to hold them. The same opposites, but you are no longer the size you were when they first split you in two, and here is the part that turns this key toward you specifically. The widening does not wait for a birthday, it begins the moment you stop treating your own discomfort as evidence that something has gone wrong with you. Imagine two people who feel the exact same restlessness on the exact same Wednesday. One calls it a bad mood, medicates it with distraction, and goes to bed no different than before. The other pauses, names the restlessness honestly, asks what it might be pointing toward, and goes to bed slightly more awake to their own life than they were that morning. The restlessness was identical. The response was everything. This is not a comfortable widening. It asks something of you. It asks you to stop treating your own restlessness as a problem to be managed, and start treating it as information about what has been waiting. It asks you to hold the discomfort a moment longer than feels natural, the way you might hold a note a beat past where the song wants to resolve, because something true is often only audible in that extra beat. I stopped treating my own restlessness as a malfunction if this turn just found something true in you. Staying nearby means the next one reaches you too. That is the only thing I will ask of you today. The fifth key is the deepest one, and it asks more of you than the others, because it is the third thing given back. And it is not a feeling, it is a relationship. First, consider what Jung called individuation itself. He defined it in his essay on the ego and the unconscious as coming to selfhood, becoming one's own self. And notice what that definition quietly refuses. It refuses to describe individuation as arrival at some finished, perfected person. It describes a coming, an ongoing motion. And this matters because so many people wait for old age to deliver a finished self, a piece that simply appears fully formed. And when it doesn't arrive on schedule, they conclude something has failed in them personally. But Jung is describing a relationship that deepens, rather than a destination that appears. The relationship between the ordinary, daily, limited ego and something larger that Jung called the self, the organizing center of the whole psyche, conscious and unconscious together, not a possession you acquire, but a presence you gradually learn to hear. And here is the strange mercy, hidden in growing older. In youth, the ego is loud, ambitious, defended, convinced of its own centrality, certain that its plans and opinions are the whole of who a person is, and the self can barely get a signal through that noise. But as the years do their slow work, as the volume of ambition lowers whether invited to or not, the ego is forced to grow quieter, and in that quiet, for perhaps the first time since childhood, the self can actually be heard. Second, consider what this sounds like in an actual life. Jung himself, at 38, suffered what he later described in Memories, Dreams, Reflections as a kind of inner collapse, a period where the ambitious, achieving Jung, the rising doctor, the heir apparent to Freud, simply could not hold, and out of that collapse came years of what he called confrontation with the unconscious, the very material that produced his mature psychology. I am not telling you this to romanticize suffering. I am telling you because the pattern holds for ordinary people too. Imagine a man who ran a hardware store for 40 years. The kind of man neighbors called at all hours, because he always had the answer, the right size bolt, the quick fix, the confident opinion on every subject brought to his counter. And at 74, the store sold. The phone finally silent, he finds himself sitting across the kitchen table, while his wife tells him a story about her childhood he has heard 100 times before. And for the first time in decades, he is not waiting for his turn to speak. He is not scanning for the quick fix. He is simply listening. And afterward, he cannot explain why his eyes are wet over a story he already knew by heart. That is not a man losing his edge. That is a man finally able to hear something his own usefulness had been drowning out for half a century. Third, notice how quietly this relationship actually announces itself. It rarely arrives as vision or revelation. It arrives instead as small, almost embarrassing moments that the old ego would have brushed past on the way to somewhere more important. Picture an ordinary evening. A woman of 80, sitting on a porch after the dishes are done. Nothing scheduled, nobody needing anything from her. And she notices the particular color the sky turns just before the streetlights come on. And she notices it the way she has not noticed anything in 40 years. Not because her eyesight improved, but because nothing else is shouting for her attention. In her 30s, that same sky would have passed unseen between one obligation and the next. The ego, too busy running the morning program to receive anything so quiet. And this is worth naming plainly. The self does not compete with the noise of ambition. It does not raise its voice to be heard over the meetings and the deadlines and the performances. It simply waits underneath all of it, the way a river keeps running under a frozen surface, present the entire time, audible only once the surface stops demanding all the attention. Fourth, consider what this relationship actually gives you that nothing else can. Jung wrote of legitimate suffering, distinguishing it from the sterile suffering of neurosis, and I think this is the heart of the third gift. When the ego finally yields some of its authority to the self, the pain that remains is no longer meaningless. It becomes, in a strange way, load-bearing. It holds something up rather than simply hurting. Grief in old age does not vanish, but it stops being a random cruelty and starts being evidence that you loved specific things specifically. Loneliness in old age does not vanish, but it stops being only isolation and starts being, at moments, solitude, which is a different animal entirely. Fear of death does not vanish, but it stops being pure dread and starts, at least sometimes, being met by something steadier than the ego ever was on its own. And even boredom changes character. The empty afternoon that once felt like punishment starts to feel like room. This is what the relationship with the self actually gives back. Not comfort exactly, but company. A company that does not depend on other people being present. A company that was always available and simply could not be heard over the noise of the performance. Fifth, and this is worth sitting with longest, this deepening is not a reward for having lived well, and it is not withheld as punishment from those who feel they have lived poorly. It is available simply because the years themselves do the quieting work. Whether you cooperate or resist, the audience shrinks whether you wanted it to or not. The unlived material surfaces whether you invited it or not. The phone rings less whether you miss the ringing or not. And so the invitation here is not to earn this relationship through some late effort of virtue. It is only to stop drowning it out on purpose. To let an ordinary evening, an ordinary silence, an ordinary hour, with people who need nothing, performed from you, simply happen, without reaching for the old noise to fill it, the television turned on out of habit, the errand invented to feel useful, the opinion offered before anyone asked for it. And here is the part I want you to sit with longest of all. This third gift is the reason the first two gifts matter at all. The loosened mask and the returned unlived life are not the destination, they are the clearing. They are what has to happen before the deeper relationship becomes audible. Old age does not hand you the self on a schedule like a pension arriving on the first of the month, but it removes, piece by piece, whatever was standing loudest in the way, and what is left, when the loud things finally quiet down, has been there the entire time, waiting, patient in a way the ego never learned to be, waiting the way Nietzsche said it, waiting for you to become the person you already are. I quiet the loud parts of myself long enough to hear what has been waiting. The sixth key is the smallest and the warmest, and it is simply this: all three gifts, the loosened mask, the returned unlived life, the deepened relationship with the self, are not three separate rewards handed out at three separate ages. They are three views of the same widening. And widening is a gentler word than most people expect from the second half of life. It does not mean you become someone impressive. It means you become someone accurate, a person who finally matches, on the outside, what has been true on the inside all along. And this is worth saying plainly, because so much of the fear of aging is really a fear of subtraction with nothing behind it, an emptying with no flaw. But Jung's whole late work insists there is a flaw, that what looks like emptying is in fact a filling in of a different kind. The audience empties so the mask can rest. The calendar empties so the unlived life can speak. The ego's volume lowers so the self can finally be heard. None of this is decline dressed up kindly. It is what the years were always for. And I think of an ordinary woman, 79, whose daughter visits every Sunday, worried that her mother seems to be fading. Slower steps, a shorter attention span for the news, less interest in the things that used to occupy her. And the daughter names this decline because decline is the only word she has been given for an old woman growing quiet. But sit in that kitchen a little longer, and you notice something the daughter misses. The mother is not fading, she is simplifying. She no longer performs interest in things that never interested her. She no longer manages the room the way she once did at every family gathering for 40 years. She laughs at smaller things and cries at smaller things, and neither embarrasses her anymore. She has stopped defending a self that used to require constant defense, and if you ask her, gently, what these years have taken, she will list the expected losses: a husband, a career, the quickness of her own body. But if you ask her what she has, unexpectedly, more of, she will go quiet for a moment, the way people do when a true answer surprises even them, and then she will say something like, "I notice things now. The light on the wall in the afternoon, the sound of my daughter's voice before I hear the words." And that noticing, that widened attention, is not consolation prize. It is the very thing this whole teaching has been pointing toward. The same three gifts arriving together in one unremarkable Sunday afternoon: less mask, more truth, less performance, more feeling that was always there, less ego shouting, more of something steadier answering back. And this is why the sixth key does not ask you to wait for some dramatic reckoning to arrive on schedule. It asks you to notice it is already arriving, in smaller rooms, at smaller hours, in the quiet, after the loud things finally lower their voice. The widening does not announce itself. It simply becomes, one Tuesday at a time, the shape of a life that has stopped needing to prove itself and started, instead, simply being lived. I trust what age is filling in, even while it looks like it is taking away. Here is the whole picture. The morning program runs its course and does not need to be mourned as failure. The mask loosens and gives back a self no longer performed. The unlived life surfaces and gives back everything competence once required you to leave behind. The old opposites widen, instead of resolving, and ask something real of you. And underneath all three, a relationship with the self grows audible, exactly because the noise finally quiets. They were never three separate keys. They were three turns of the one motion Jung spent his whole life describing, becoming who you already are. And if you find yourself afraid of what these years are taking, I would ask you to notice, gently, what they might be handing back in the same moment. Quietly, without asking your permission first, I make the unconscious conscious. Old age doesn't take everything from you. And I wonder, now, what you might finally be able to hear in the quiet it leaves behind.